So we're studying from the book of 1 Samuel, and we are ready to start in chapter 23 of 1 Samuel. So we'll pick up there, and we're going to study through the month of July. We'll see how far we get. My goal is that we'll reach the end of 1 Samuel, although it's a little uncertain. You may be aware that 1st and 2nd Samuel originally, apparently, were just one book, just one continuous writing. At some point in past history of the Bible, they got divided in about the middle, and we now have them printed in our Bibles as two separate books, the first book of Samuel and the second book of Samuel. But if you start reading in 1 Samuel and you just read through to the end of 1 Samuel and keep on going into 2 Samuel, you see it is just one continuous, mostly chronological narrative about the history of the ancient Israelites. And it begins in 1 Samuel at the time of the prophet Samuel, and right at the end of the period of the judges and at the beginning of the period of the kings. If you start reading, go back to the very beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And you start with the first verse of the first chapter of Genesis, and you start reading through, you're going to pretty much see a chronological view of God's dealing with his people from Genesis to Exodus to Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And then after Deuteronomy, Joshua and Judges. You get to the end of Deuteronomy, and you're at the end of the time of Moses and the children of Israel coming out of Egypt. And then you pick up in the beginning of Joshua, and you just keep on going through history. And then there's the time of the Israelites moving into Canaan, and they're conquering, and through the book of Joshua. And then they are firmly established in Canaan. And then you pick up in the book of, from Joshua, you go to Judges, and then you pick up there at the beginning of the Judges, and you go through the time period when they didn't have a king. They had, no, I shouldn't say that. I should say they did have a king, but their king was Jehovah God. And then, and that didn't satisfy them. And you go through the book of Judges, and you see some very interesting and dramatic stories about interesting people that were their sort of temporary military leaders during that time. And then you get to the end of Joshua and Judges, get the end of Judges, and then there's the book of Ruth, which is not exactly chronologically placed, except that the events of the book of Ruth take place during the time of the conquest of Canaan. And then you come to 1 Samuel. And just keep on going. You're still reading chronologically. If you want to see a good chronological view of God's dealing with his people, just start reading in the book of Genesis and keep going. Genesis you get up to 1 Samuel, and now we are ready to see the beginning of the kingdom. That is, a king will be appointed over them because they wanted a king. It's a little unclear why they wanted a king. They say they wanted a king. They wanted a king to be like the nations around them. Everybody else has a king. Why can't we have a king? And so it was a rejection of God as their king. But that's what we see at the beginning of 1 Samuel. So if you want to read about the kingdom, start in 1 Samuel and then keep on going. 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings. You get to the end of 2 Kings, and then you've got 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2 Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. 1st and 2nd Chronicles cover basically the same time period as the books of Samuel and the Kings, but from a somewhat different frame of reference. And so what we read about Saul and David and Solomon and the other kings in 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, we can read some more about them in 1st and 2nd Chronicles from a slightly different point of view. Okay, and then we've got Ezra and Nehemiah, which tell us about that, by the way, through the time of the kings takes us up to the Babylonian captivity. And then things become very different for them at that point. Ezra and Nehemiah then are in that time of when they are returning from the captivity. And then we're ready for the judges, excuse me, not the judges, the prophets, the time of the prophets, and we've got the books of prophecy, and then we come to the end of the books of prophecy, and we're ready for the New Testament. That's a basic overview of all of the Old Testament. Okay, it maybe is helpful. I think it's helpful to see where all of the narrative of the Old Testament sort of fits together chronologically. And so in 1 Samuel, we're at the beginning of the time of the kings. In 1 Samuel, I'm going to be reading today from the New American Standard Translation, if you've got another translation, that's fine. I don't have a particular reason to use New American Standard. It's a good translation. I like it. I use it a good bit. I use other translations from time to time. I like using my tablet here because I've got about a bazillion different translations. Not quite, but almost about a bazillion different translations. And one game that I play with myself sometimes when we've got a preacher or a speaker who I'm not familiar with, it's like, let me see if I can figure out which translation he's using. And it may take me a while, and sometimes I don't get it. I've learned that at the Brentwood Church in Nashville, where I worship when I'm down there, the English Standard Version seems to dominate. So when I go to Brentwood, I switch to English Standard. And when I'm here, New American Standard seems to dominate. So here I use New American Standard. And there are other translations that are equally good and valid. If you would like to have a New American Standard to use while I'm reading, I find it difficult to read along with someone reading from the Bible when we've got two different translations. I mean, you can do it, but I find it a little annoying. And so I like to have the same translation that the reader is using. Our Pew Bibles here are mostly New American Standard, although I was looking around before we started this morning and I found a couple of King James translations too, which is fine, but it's not going to match word for word the New American Standard that I'll be reading from. Okay, now we're going to be studying 1 Samuel starting in chapter 23, but I want to begin today actually in the New Testament, oddly enough. I want to make a couple of points out of the New Testament before we go back to 1 Samuel chapter 23. And let me see, where am I? I'm in the Gospel of Luke, and I'm in the very last chapter of the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24 of Luke. And in chapter 24 of Luke, Jesus, if you look at the narrative of Jesus' life, Jesus has been crucified. His ministry, his earthly ministry has mostly come to an end. He has been crucified and he has been resurrected. And we find in chapter 24 the discussion of Jesus's resurrection and some events following his resurrection before and up until the time of his ascension back to the Father. I want to look starting in verse 13. I'm not sure exactly how much to read here. I'd kind of like to read verses 13 through 35. I think we will not read all of that. But this is an incident that you may know of Jesus after his resurrection appearing to two of his followers on the road to Emmaus. You know about the road to Emmaus? Emmaus was a small town not too far from Jerusalem. I understand it was about 7 miles. Verse 13 here in Luke 24, verse 13 says, "And behold, two of them," that is two of Jesus's followers, "behold, two of them were going that very day." This seems to be the very day of his resurrection. And early in the morning, some of the women had gone to the tomb and discovered that it was empty, and Jesus is raised, and they're still trying to figure out what's going on here. And Jesus had told them he was going to die and be raised, and they didn't understand what he was talking about. Well, he was talking about he was going to die and be raised. He was like really very direct with that, but they just didn't get it. They couldn't comprehend what he was talking about. So they're still trying to kind of figure out what's going on. Is he really raised? Is he not really raised? And this seems to have been on that very same day that he was raised. It says, behold, two of them were going that very day to a village named Emmaus, which was about 7 miles from Jerusalem. So probably walking along there to Emmaus. If you were 7 miles, to me seems like a long way to walk. I'd drive it in my Honda. Of course, they didn't have Hondas then, and most of their travel was walking. You could maybe ride a donkey if you had one, or in a cart or something. They were probably just walking 7 miles. You could probably do it in a couple of hours if you just hit the road and went for it. But they were conversing, verse 14, they were conversing with each other about all of these things which had taken place. And it came about that while they were conversing and discussing, Jesus himself approached and began traveling with them, but their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. We don't know exactly what that was like. Why? How were their eyes prevented? It's a little unclear of what that actually meant, but they were disciples of his, but they didn't realize that this was Jesus that was walking along with them and talking with them. And Jesus says, what are these words that you're exchanging with one another as you are walking? And they stood still, looking sad. And one of them, named Cleopas, answered and said to him, are you the only one visiting Jerusalem and unaware of the things which have happened here in these days? Everybody's talking about it. Everybody knows what's going on with Jesus of Nazareth. Are you the only one that doesn't know what's going on? That's what they were talking about, what had happened. One of them named Cleopas. We don't know for sure who Cleopas was. There are all kinds of speculations about that, and I'm not going to go down that road with you today. The bottom line is, after you read people's speculations about who Cleopas actually was, the end result is that you've got speculations, and nobody really knows for sure who Cleopas was. The other of the two individuals is never identified here in the Gospels, but they were disciples of Jesus. They were apparently not 2 of the 12 apostles. They seem to have not been any of those. But Jesus says, what are you talking about? And Cleopas says, well, are you the only one that doesn't know what's going on and hasn't heard about it? And he said to them, what things? Verse 19. And they said to him, the things about Jesus the Nazarene, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word in the sight of God and all the people, and how the chief priests and our rulers delivered him up to sentence of death and crucified him. But we were hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel. They knew of the prophecies of the Messiah and had for a long, long time, and they were hoping that he was the one, but he's dead. Indeed, besides all this, it is the 3rd day since these things happened. But also some women among us amazed us when they were at the tomb in the morning, and just this morning, and did not find his body. They came saying that they had also seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. My, oh my, how surprised they would have been to realize they're talking to him and they didn't even realize that he was alive. Verse 24, and some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just exactly as the women also had said, but him they did not see. They'd been to the tomb. He was definitely not there. And he said to them, Jesus speaking to these 2 of his disciples, "O foolish men and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken." What's he telling them? You're foolish. You should believe in what the prophets have spoken. They were, I don't know about these 2 particular men. Like we said, we don't know for sure exactly who they were, but the prophets, the people, the Jews of Jesus' day, the Pharisees, the scribes, the common people, that worshiped in the synagogues, they knew the prophets. They had read the prophets. They were familiar with what the prophets had said about the Messiah, about the one who would be coming. And it's interesting that they knew all of what the prophets had said, and yet they didn't understand it. And when Jesus came, it's like, yeah, we know the Messiah. We know of the Messiah. We know who the Messiah will be. We know what he will be like. And they could point to Jesus and they'd say, you ain't him. Pardon my grammar. You're not the one. We've read the prophets and you don't match what we've read. They didn't understand from reading the prophets. Look what happens. Jesus said, "O foolish men and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and to enter into his glory?" You're trying to figure out what's going on with the death of this one that you hoped would be the Messiah, and you're thinking now, well, maybe he probably wasn't. If you had read and understood what the old writings, if you had read and understood what was said in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and the books following on into the time of the judges, on into the time of the kings, on into the time of Samuel and Saul and David, if you had really understood that, you'd understand what's going on here. And look what it says now, verse 27. And beginning with Moses, went all the way back to the very beginning, to the writing of Moses, and beginning with Moses and with all of the prophets, he explained to them the things concerning himself in all the scriptures. What were the scriptures at this time, as far as they were concerned? To me, the scriptures are the whole Bible. What were the scriptures for them? The writings. I thought I heard somebody say something. The Old Testament. They didn't have the Gospels yet. They didn't have, Saul of Tarsus was still a non-believer. He was still a Pharisee at this point. We don't know anything about where Saul was and what he was doing. And when he became the Apostle Paul, we didn't have any of those letters that he wrote after he became a believer and an apostle of the Lord. They didn't have any of it. To them, the scriptures were the old Hebrew scriptures, what we would call the Old Testament. So Jesus explains to them, in the beginning with Moses and with all the prophets, he explained to them the things concerning himself in all the scripture. I want to say all of this from the New Testament because I want us to think, I want to keep this in the back of our minds. Actually, maybe keep it in the front of your mind. Keep it in your mind there somewhere. But remember, when we are studying from the Old Testament, when we are reading about the prophet Samuel, and we're reading about the first king Saul and the one who eventually became the second king David, and so on, what are we reading about? What are we studying when we're studying from the life of David, which I'm particularly interested in the latter part of 1 Samuel? What are we studying? Do you realize that what we're studying we're studying all things about Jesus when we study from the Old Testament? I would like you to keep this in mind. We read through these narratives about all of the events that happened, and you go from one verse to the next, from one chapter to the next, and there are all these details about all kinds of things that took place here among the ancient Hebrews. And you read about Saul, and here in 1 Samuel, you read about Samuel and Saul and David and the things they did. They went here and they had this fight with these people, and they fought the Philistines here, and they fought somebody else over here, and they fought with each other, and all of these details. You think, well, what am I supposed to get out of this? What am I supposed to learn out of it? Why read any of this and study it? You know why? It's because of what Luke says here. It's because of what Jesus did with those two men on the road to Emmaus. He went back to the scriptures, which was the old Hebrew writings, the law, the prophets, the narratives of the kings, and from there, he taught them about himself. That's what the Old Testament is about. It's about Jesus. It's not always so clear in one verse to the next to the next. We can read verse Testament and say, well, what does this tell me about Jesus? And the answer is, I'm not sure I see that it tells me anything about Jesus. But that if you look at the broad sweep of the narrative, and I'm particularly interested in David here, but when you, in the latter part of 1 Samuel, when you look at the broad sweep of the narrative about David, especially about Saul, the King Saul first, and then David, and the difficulty that Saul and David had with each other, and then the ultimately the death of Saul, which we haven't come to yet, and then the crowning of David as king, and you're reading about all of that. Think about what is this telling me about Jesus? Okay, that's my first point from the New Testament. Second point from the New Testament, I want to go to the very first verse of the New Testament. If I can find it here, the book of Matthew. Matthew chapter 1, verse 1. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Very first verse of the New Testament describes Jesus as the son of David. That's a big thing. That's an important thing to us, that Jesus is the son of David. I would suggest that Jesus is the son of David in two different ways. You read chapter 1 of the book of Matthew, and you see the genealogy that takes us from Abraham down through the generations, down through the time of the kings, and you see that David was a descendant of Abraham. And then you go on from David on down through the generations following David, and you see that Jesus was a descendant of David, biologically. As a man born of a woman. Jesus was a son of David in that sense. But I would suggest that Jesus was a son of David in another sense. What might that be? And here's another verse. This is from the Gospels, from the book of Mark. Book of Mark, chapter 3. This is near the beginning of the Gospel of Mark, near the beginning of Jesus's ministry. Chapter 3, verse 13. And he went up to the mountain and summoned those whom he himself wanted, and they came to him, and he appointed 12 that they might be with him, and that he might send them out to preach and to have authority to cast out the demons. This is the appointing of the 12 apostles. And then it names them here. And he appointed the 12, Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter, and James, the son of Zebedee, and John, the brother of James. To them he gave the name Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. And I'll stop there because I'm interested in that name, that nickname that he gave them, Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. He called them the sons of thunder. What does that mean? They were the sons of thunder. Their father was a man whose name was Thunder? No, that's not what that means, is it? This is a figure of speech among them. It's a way that they would talk about people and describe a person's personality, a person's character, maybe even a kind of job that a person does. Sons of thunder, what does that mean? The son is like the father. The son is like the father in the work that he does. That's the way they went to vocational school. If your father is a carpenter, you know what you're going to be? You're going to be a carpenter because your father is going to teach you carpentry, and that's what you're going to do. Jesus is identified, isn't this, in the Gospels when he goes to Nazareth, his hometown, and he's preaching and teaching in Nazareth, and saying, well, who's this guy think he is? They say, isn't this the carpenter's son? Which would be, it's like he's a carpenter himself because he's the carpenter's son. The son has the attributes of the father. That's the way they tended to think of people. Boanerges, the sons of thunder. What does that mean? That tells you something about the personalities of James and John. I'm not, in detail, I'm not sure, but they seem to have been, they were the ones that wanted to call down fire from heaven on some of the people that rejected Jesus. It's like, wow, call down fire from heaven. That's a pretty drastic response to people who don't want to listen to preaching. Should we call down fire from heaven? It's like, they seem to be kind of sort of hot-headed kind of men. They were like their father. Their father is thunder. They're the sons of thunder. Okay. When the book of Matthew describes Jesus as the son of David, I think it's not just talking about his biological lineage, but I think it's also talking about the son is like the father in that sense. If you want to know who Jesus is and what Jesus is like, now Jesus is the son of God the Father as well. And if you really want to know about the Father, then study the Son. If you want to know what God is like, study the Son, Jesus, and you'll know what God is like. But Jesus is described as the son of David. And so we can find in the life of David, I think, some things that when you look at David and you think about who he is and what he was doing and why he was doing it, I think you can see some things that are foreshadowing the character of Jesus himself. It's not that Jesus was exactly like David or David was exactly like Jesus. By the time we get to the end of 2 Samuel in our study, you're going to see that in some ways David's life was just one hot mess of bad decisions and bad choices that he made. And he paid a heavy price for some of the bad choices that he made throughout his life. Jesus wasn't like David in that regard. Jesus was not the sinner that David was. But one thing you see about David is you see a man of great faith in God and the Father. And you see a man, despite all of his flaws and his shortcomings, you see a man who throughout his life was devoted to his faith in God and his faith in the Father. We can see some other things about David that I think that reflect some things that we can learn from him, that we can learn about Jesus. So anyway, let's go now that we're nearing the end of our class period. Let's go to 1 Samuel chapter 23 and pick up with the narrative here about King Saul and David, who would become king. Saul, when he was appointed king, you might think back, if you've been here with us through the study of the early part of 1 Samuel, you'll see that Saul, when he was first appointed king, seemed to be a man of humility, seemed to be a man of faith in God, and perhaps that was one reason God chose him to appoint as king. But you see a change that takes place in Saul through 1 Samuel, and you see that man who started out as a man of humble faith in God. You see him become somebody of quite different character after he became king. You may be familiar with the quotation from Lord Acton, the 19th century British sort of a philosopher, a writer and philosopher of politics and politician himself. He was in the House of Commons. We know him as Lord Acton. I don't know what his full name was. But that comment from Lord Acton that said, power corrupts. And what next? Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I think Lord Acton got it right, and you see that at work in Saul. Saul got a taste of power, and that power corrupted Saul, I think. And by the time you get over into chapter 23 and surrounding narrative, you see a man who had been very corrupted by power. And we see this in our own culture, in our own country, even in our own circle of acquaintances. Maybe we see that there are people who have a lust for power and control over others. And, you know, you look down through modern history at the various dictators and military strongmen and kings and emperors and such. And you see people that and even in our own politics and Congress, if you want to see people that have a lust for power, I'll tell you, Washington is full of them. And probably Frankfurt too, and maybe even the county courthouse. You see people with lust who have this lust for power. Power tends to corrupt people when they get it. We are now, it's like 250 years and one day ago is the beginning of our country. And one thing, you know, first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen was. Do they teach you these things in history class anymore in school? George Washington, first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. Somebody said that about him a long time ago. One of the things about George Washington that amazed the kings and potentates of Europe is that when he led the army that won the war, that defeated the otherwise most powerful army in the world at the time, the British Army, and he led the army that defeated them, and he did not crown himself King of America. One of the amazing things about George Washington, and they could hardly believe it, it is alleged, I don't know if there's any truth to this, it may be one of those things that's hard to pin down, but there are some who said that King George III said that if he just resigns his office as general and goes home, he will be the greatest man in the world. And that's exactly what he did. And whether King George actually said that or not, I don't know. But if George Washington, I got my Georges wrong, if George Washington had been like Saul, we would probably still be living under a king, except it wouldn't be a British king, it would be an American king. Power corrupts, and that's what happened to Saul. Power corrupted Saul, I think. And we're now in the midst of the narrative of the corruption of Saul. And interesting thing about David is David's humility. David didn't yet have fully the power he did when he was king. But David had some attributes and some characteristics that we can see in Jesus. Chapter 22, if we go back to chapter 22, there's an interesting incident that shows us the corruption of Saul. David had received some support and some help from the high priest, actually. What was his name? Ahimelech? And David had received some help from the high priest. And Saul found out about it. One of Saul's chief shepherd was present at the time when why he was there and what he was doing there, I don't know. But when David was receiving that help from the high priest, Saul's shepherd Doeg was his name, was present. And Doeg told Saul about the priest helping David, which really lit Saul up. And he ended up killing the priests because of that. The priests of God, he had them killed. He called upon some of his men to kill them. And they said, we're not doing that. The priests of God, we're not killing them. And so he goes to Doeg. He says, okay, so you do it. Doeg said, yeah, I'll do it. And so he did. And Doeg killed the priests of God. One of them escaped. This is the end of chapter 22, verse 20. But one son of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. And Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the priests of the Lord. Then David said to Abiathar, I knew on that day when Doeg the Edomite was there that he would surely tell Saul, He said, I knew he would do that, and he did. He said, I have brought about the death of every person in your father's household. It's all my fault. I knew Doeg was going to do that. I didn't give warnings. David felt it's like it's my fault, although it really wasn't. No, but notice verse 23. By the way, here's one thing that I think we can see. We see a foreshadowing of Jesus. Verse 23, stay with me, do not be afraid, for he who seeks my life seeks your life, for you are safe with me. What does that tell you about the son of David? The one who has David's attributes and David's character. What could you say about David that is like Jesus here? You see a protector, you see a deliverer of this priest that survived Abiathar. David uses his position as a man of increasing power. He says, I will protect you. You come and you be with me, and I will protect you. You see some similarity to Jesus there. Jesus was the son of David, not just a physical descendant, but also a sort of spiritual descendant in a way. Jesus had characteristics that we can read about that David had. Then they told David, we're going down on into chapter 23. Then they told David, saying, behold, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah and are plundering the threshing floors. Keilah was a small town, seems to have been a few miles southwest of Jerusalem. It's maybe, if you look on your Old Testament Bible maps, you may find it there. It's not always entirely clear where these places were. This is one of the difficulties of reading some of the narratives here. It talks about they went here and did this, and then they went there and did that, and it's not entirely clear exactly where they were on our modern day maps. But Keilah was a small town within a few miles of Jerusalem. And the Philistines have attacked them, and they're plundering the threshing floors. The threshing floors it was a thing of value in an agrarian society where they were raising grains, and the threshing floor was part of preparing their grains to separate from the chaff, and it could be ground into flour and made into bread and so on. So if they're attacking the fresh, they're going at the economic. David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go and attack these Philistines? And then the Lord said to David, go and attack these Philistines and deliver Keilah. David's not a king. You know, the king should be the one that's protecting the people. The king is not protecting the people. The king is on this vendetta against David. But David is going to protect the people. That's what he's about. David had his own small group of followers. In chapter 22, it stated that at that time he had about 400 with him. Over in verse 13 of chapter 23, David had, by the time we get to chapter 23, David has about 600 men that were following David, following after him. And they were sort of his own army in a way that he was leading. Not very big, but David was a man of increasing political and military power here. And so David says, so we should go and help these people in this small town. So, but notice David asks God. David doesn't take it upon himself. Is this what God wants? And so David asks God. And God says, yeah, go and help them. And we're out of time. That's the second bell. David's men said to him, behold, we are afraid here in Judah. How much more then if we go to Keilah against the ranks of the Philistines? It's hard enough here in what we've got to confront with Saul here in Judah. Now you want us to go fight the Philistines? I don't know exactly why David felt he needed to go to God a second time. Maybe he's just trying to convince him, yes, we need to go fight the Philistines. God told me, go fight the Philistines to help out this small town. You want me to ask him again? I'll ask him again if you'd like. But David, I'm not sure exactly why David had to ask God a second time. But David asked God a second time, and he says, yes, go down to Keilah, for I will give the Philistines into your hand. So David and his men went to Keilah and fought with the Philistines, and he led away their livestock and struck them with great slaughter. Thus David, notice this word, thus David delivered the inhabitants of Keilah. Jesus was the son of David. Jesus had David's attributes. David was a deliverer. Who is our deliverer? Our deliverer is Jesus. So we're out of time. We'll quit here today. We'll continue next Sunday, picking up at this point in chapter 23. Read chapters 23 and 24. And while you're reading them, be thinking about, do I see things here and about David that shows me that Jesus is his spiritual son? Okay, I'll see you next Sunday.